Hello, everybody. This is Benny Lewis from Fluent in 3 months, and today I have with me Scott Young, and Scott is going to be talking to us about rapid learning. So Scott and I have been friends for a very long time, and I've been I've been intimately following his projects, and also even sometimes mentoring him in his projects. And I think the funniest thing is literally how we met, Scott. Can you tell people the very first time we met and why that might be different to how other English speakers tend to meet?
Yeah, so the first time we met would have been about 10 years ago, and I was trying to learn French. I was living in France. I was still in university. I was on a university exchange, and I was doing it probably the wrong way, trying to learn French, mostly speaking English with people that I met in the country. I think a very common first time you're learning a language mistake. And I remember I'd been there for a few months. I'd been frustrating, and someone told me about you and how you were doing these Fluent in 3 months projects. And I was like, oh my God, I got to meet this guy. And so I reached out to you, met you in Paris, and sort of from reading your blog, I kind of got a sense of your method. And so for the first time we met, we spoke only in French. We tried to have that conversation in French, and you gave me a very nice tour of Paris. And that was sort of the start of our friendship. And since then, that was kind of near the start of your blog too, that you'd only done like one or two challenges sort of publicly as well. And since then I've done my own projects, you've done your own projects, and we've been friends for over a decade now.
Yeah. And I wanted to touch on both your language learning projects and of course several of your other rapid learning projects, because after you'd kicked that off, you while you were studying in France, you were able to push that French up a notch. But then you had something a lot more similar to the kind of 3-month projects that I tend to have. Yeah. So this was your year without English. So what was that all about?
Yeah, so this was a couple years after having that French experience. And I think the experience that I had, what it taught me was how important it is to set up habits of communicating with the people around you to speak in the language that you're trying to actually learn. Because once you establish that you're going to speak in English to someone, it becomes really hard. There's so much friction to just be, okay, now I'm going to speak this language that I speak really badly. And so I kind of had this idea that had sort of obsessed me after that time of like, well, what if you did it like perfectly? What if like as soon as you got off the plane, you only spoke in the language you were trying to learn? And so I have this friend, Vat, and we were already talking about maybe doing some kind of trip together. And I was interested in language learning. As I said, what if we tried doing this? What if we went to 4 different countries? And the 3-month mark is really useful because that's about the length of a typical tourist visa. So it's not an arbitrary amount of time. That's usually the amount of time you can stay somewhere. And we decided to go to Spain to learn Spanish, Brazil to learn Portuguese, China to learn Mandarin, and South Korea to learn Korean. And so we followed very much the kind of approach you set out there, maybe even with the additional rule of this no English rule being a little bit more stringent than sometimes you are. And it worked really well. And it was so funny because you were actually in Valencia, Spain at the same time we were doing that. So you got to see us from our little, baby bird fledgling, leaving the nest stage to having conversations and hanging out and having fun in España. So it's a really great time.
Yeah, and I it's like you said, you had a level of dedication that even I haven't had in some of my projects. Like whenever there was, we might be hanging out together, and there might be somebody in the group who only spoke English. You would still speak Spanish, and I would have to translate what you're saying. And sometimes I wouldn't use exactly the words that you personally would use, which was a very funny way of doing it. But you did maintain your consistency.
It was obnoxious to any people who didn't speak Spanish who were hanging out with us at the time, because it's like I speak English perfectly well, and yet I'm using Benny as a translator to translate my bad Spanish into into English. But I know it sounds kind of extreme, and I've had conversations with people about this kind of project about like, well, why go to that extent? But it really worked, and it really allowed us to make friends in that language, and really allowed us to get to a level of immersiveness and social communication in the language in a level that I wasn't able to get until very near the end of my time in France. So a year of struggle and grinding was like, okay, now I'm okay maybe having a short conversation. That was like 3 weeks in Spain. And so I think this overall approach of rapid learning, which I'm going to talk about with you a little bit more, it doesn't just apply to language learning. It's an overall philosophy towards how can you optimize your learning efforts to get the results that you really want to get, even if it often involves doing things that are a little bit unconventional.
And while we're still on the language learning part of it, what do you think would be the biggest lessons that you would have learned, or the aspects of how your year without English that you would have applied to learning these languages that you wouldn't have done with your French project? Like how was it truly a rapid learning project? How it would be different to someone who's just kind of doing a New Year's resolution to learn a language, say?
So I think the main thing that I kind of learned from doing this project, and I think the thing that most people wouldn't fully appreciate if they're just hearing about this project, because I think just explaining to people that if you don't speak English and you only speak the language you're trying to learn, that would work to learn a language kind of makes sense. I mean, most people already believe that if you just go to a country, you'll just automatically learn the language. So there's already this presumption that would work. Even though that's not true, that there's people who have lived in countries for decades and don't learn the language. So put that aside for a moment. But I think the thing that most people would not expect is that this is actually easier than doing it the way that I did in France. So the way that I used to learn Spanish was easier than the partial immersion that I used in French. And this is very counterintuitive, because it seems like what I did in Spain was like, yeah, it worked, but it was way harder. That's way more effort. And so the fact that it was the opposite is the hardest thing that I have as a time convincing people. But the reason is that a lot of what the difficulty is kind of overcoming this social awkwardness to speak a language that you don't speak very well. And the problem when you engage in this kind of partial immersion, and what I mean by full immersion is not that you literally are speaking 100% of your time in the language, because some people have jobs or commitments that they can't. But rather, if I get used to speaking to Benny in Spanish, it's awkward for a little bit, but then it becomes normal, and then we just do it. And if you do this with enough people and enough situations, it becomes normal for a large chunk of your day, and so you're getting hours and hours of practice that just feel normal to you. In contrast, if I speak with Benny sometimes in Spanish, but other times in English, it's always awkward every time I start speaking to him in Spanish. If I started speaking to you in Spanish right now, it would feel a little awkward because we've spent the last couple of years speaking back in English to each other. And so I think the point that I want to make and what I want to get across about this is not simply that there are more effective ways of learning, but that if you design your project around an effective method, you often find it takes less total effort because you spend less time working against yourself. You spend more time doing the thing that actually gets results.
Yeah. Okay, and I think as well as the language learning projects, this year, a lot of people are going to be taking the time to have any kind of intensive learning project just to make the best use of their time if it's available to them. So another one of your projects was the MIT challenge. So could you tell us what that is, what that was all about?
Sure. So this was a project shortly after I graduated from university, and I'd studied business in school, and I felt like a lot of people that the thing that I studied in school, I wanted to study something else, but I didn't really want to go back to school and spend tens of thousands of dollars on tuition and spend another 4 years of my life. And the thing that I wanted to study was computer science. I wanted to understand how the internet worked, artificial intelligence, making programs. This seemed like the thing that I wanted to have really studied, but I studied business instead. And so I was kind of mulling about what to do about this when I found out that on MIT's website, they post a lot of their material online for free. And I did one of these classes and I found that it was a lot better than classes I had paid money for to attend in school. And so this kind of got the idea of like, if you could take a class online, maybe you could try to simulate an MIT degree. And so this began the MIT challenge, which was to learn MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum and doing it well enough to pass the final exams and do the programming projects. But instead of going to MIT, I would do it from home. And instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, I would spend just, a couple $100 on used textbooks. And I would do it in 12 months instead of 4 years. So this was sort of my first big project, the thing that kind of a lot of people know me for. And it went really well. I started in October 2011, and I finished the last class in September 2012. And again, using a lot of these sort of intensive, but ultimately I would say, I felt like it was a really rewarding year, something that I got a lot out of. So this kind of intensive learning project can often be quite valuable compared to the way we often feel about going to school, where you might feel like you didn't get much out of it.
Yeah. And whenever someone might hear your story, they may be inclined to think, well, you're just some natural genius who can do an MIT course in a single year, or learn 4 languages at the drop of a hat. Like, what would you say to that, to people who just think they don't have any innate talent to learn things quickly?
Well, the way I would put it is this way. I think every single person has their own strengths and weaknesses, their own pace that they're going to go at. So I don't want to say that anyone can learn a language in 3 months or anyone can learn an MIT degree in 1 year. I think that's a little bit foolish to say that. But what I do want to say is that I've personally experienced learning things the wrong way and then learning things the right way. So my experience in France, I spent 12 months and I worked the whole year to learn French. So this wasn't like, I just wasn't trying. I was trying really hard for a whole year to learn French. But in Spain, I learned Spanish better in 3 months than I did in French in an entire year. And that was just by designing the project the right way and picking the right method. And so I can't say what you'll accomplish. I don't know, but I also think you don't know. I also think you don't know what you could accomplish if you were to approach things the right way. And so that's all I'm really trying to offer, is to give people a new way of thinking about their learning projects so that they might be able to do something that they didn't think was possible before.
Okay, and in terms of structuring that and coming up with this plan that you've referenced, I did want to recommend people check out your updated Rapid Learner course. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how that kind of ties in with what we've been talking about?
Sure. So I've written thousands of articles on my website about learning. And so if you're kind of not sure what these ideas are and you want to check them out for yourself, you can check out the blog. But for those who want to go deeper, I have a 6-week course called Rapid Learner. And this 6-week course guides you through sort of each step of picking a project, designing it, making sure you stick to it, developing a productivity system, and then engaging in effective studying methods. And I've spent basically the last decade researching cognitive science and learning methods, and obviously trying them firsthand to see which ones actually work, to develop a method so that regardless of what you want to learn, whether it's a language, whether it's a musical instrument, whether it's a school subject, whether it's starting a business, there is an approach that you can apply that will make your approach to learning more efficient, more effective, which can often mean learning things more quickly or with less stress and frustration. And so the 6-week course guides you through sort of each phase of this methodology, so you can go through and approach any new learning challenge and follow it with the 6-week course, and it'll help you structure your efforts so that you'll be making better decisions in what you choose to learn.
Okay, and so do you really think that if somebody has very varied kinds of learning projects, that it's really down to the system itself? It intuitively, it doesn't make sense if somebody thinks to themselves, I want to learn piano over the next couple of months versus I want to become a computer programmer over the next couple of months. So what parallels would bring them all together that you think the Rapid Learner course actually talks about? Because for a lot of people, it's not necessarily intuitive that the learning techniques and the systems are common to all of these.
Well, this is definitely true. There's definitely unique challenges to learning different things. And I've done very different kinds of projects. So learning mathematics and computer science was different from learning languages. I've also done projects to learn quantum physics, to learn cognitive science, to learn portrait drawing. And so each of these projects had their own unique differences, but I think that they have a lot more in common than people realize, because regardless of what you're doing, when you are engaged in a learning project, you're trying to make changes to your brain in order to do something better. And so that involves practice, that involves memory, that involves understanding, that involves skill, that involves figuring out resources, identifying your own weak points. It involves structuring your efforts and creating a productivity system so you can focus. And so while there are going to be specific challenges to each unique thing you face, and I highly recommend using great resources like your website to find tips for learning not just languages, but for learning Spanish, and not just learning Spanish, but for learning Iberian Spanish, and all of these specific details do help and they do come into play. The more you have the overall scaffolding for understanding how learning works, the more you can get a general ballpark of what will be the right way to learn any particular project. So you're going to be in the right zone of learning something, and then you can just fine tune it to the exact point. Whereas for a lot of people, and I talk about this in the course, they have these cognitive illusions about the right way to study, that they engage in things that definitely aren't going to work, and they're not even aware that they're making these mistakes.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that we've definitely covered what people need to know when it comes to the Rapid Learner course. So anything else you want to tell us about it?
Sure. Well, I highly recommend checking it out. I know that we're going to be offering a special link to the Fluent month readers, 3 months readers to check out the promotion. But I also recommend checking out the website. I know that obviously with promotions like this, you're not quite sure what I'm going to teach or whether it's going to be applicable to you. I've got hundreds, thousands of articles on learning. So you can check out and see for yourself. If you think that some of these free ideas have value, then I highly recommend checking out the full course, where we have hundreds of hours of video guiding you through step by step through a lot of these particular tactics, strategies, and overall concepts that can help you learn better.
Yep, and I can definitely personally recommend it because I have known Scott for quite a while, and I know he's given me advice. He actually helped me to write my first ever ebook and gave me loads of tips for when I was growing the blog, because when I started the blog, you had already been blogging for quite some time.
Yeah, I've been there for a little while. Yeah.
You've been there for a while, so I've actually personally learned quite a lot from Scott, which is exactly why I wanted to make sure that we were sharing his Rapid Learner course with all of you guys, so you could check it out during this promotion. So again, check out the link below. We'll give you a lot more details about that. But otherwise, definitely check out Scott's stuff, and you'll see he has plenty of articles and lots of things to help people when it comes to rapid learning. And I know it's going to be a very important way that people take advantage of the next months to improve themselves in some way, and the best way to do that is to learn something new. So this is the ideal time to improve your methods of learning new things. So
thank you so much for having me to talk about this with you.
Thank you very much, Scott, and everyone check out his stuff, and otherwise, happy language learning.